All right, here we are with the games of the year 2019. For the most part, I had a hard time with 2019 as a whole, mostly because I didn't have a lot of games on my radar going into the year. I mentioned in 2018 in my Games of the Year video towards the end that there weren't a lot of games that I was looking forward to playing. There was only a couple, and as 2019 played out, it kept that really slow momentum. There were plenty of games that I slowly became interested in, but I never really got around to playing a lot of games that released this year. And so in a lot of ways, that's kind of disappointing for me, because while I did play some magnificent games this year, I didn't really branch out as much as I wanted to. So I guess I gotta work on that for 2020. My favorite game that released in 2019, aka my game of the year, unsurprisingly, probably to many, is Trails of Cold Steel 3. This game is probably unfair for me against all the other contenders. I'm just really invested in this series as a whole, and I don't know what it is in particular that draws me in so much. I've tried to pinpoint it many times, and I think it's the characters, I think it's the world, maybe it's just the character building. It could be all of those things. But Trails of Cold Steel as a franchise just does so many things well with its presentation that I just have to go back to it. I look forward to it every single time. It could be, if not definitively, my favorite franchise of all time. You know, it's something that I really like. And Cold Steel 3 didn't really let up on any of that. It did stumble in, you know, framing of its story, and it did have some issues with repeating that particular framing, but the narrative is just so enjoyable, and it's excellent to see those little plot points unravel as the game goes through. And especially in this regard, it actually didn't do what the previous games did, where they would save all the information for the last section of the game. They actually gave you little tidbits throughout the entire game, and that was extremely enjoyable to experience. Trails of Cold Steel 3 is definitely by far one of the best games that I have played this year. It is most likely, if not definitively, the best JRPG that came out this year that I have played. So I'm really happy to see us get an English release of it, and have that quality actually be up to standard of prior releases made by, you know, other translators. So mad props to the Trails of Cold Steel game, mad props to the developers, and mad props to the rest of the team, because y'all brought the ruckus. Now, for my favorite game played this year, and this is a category that is not restricted by just 2019 games that have released the same year. This is any game that I played this year, and that game is Marvel's Spider-Man. If you watched my thoughts video on this game, this might not come as a surprise, but this was the best game that I played all year, bar none. It has toppled Trails of Cold Steel 3, it's toppled Kingdom Hearts 3, it's toppled any other JRPG that came out this year. I was just floored. I don't want to say I had low expectations for this game, but I had expectations that were befitting a superhero game. And if you've played any superhero game, you would kind of know what I'm talking about. You know, they don't have the same quality as other games. The older Spider-Man games were great, but you know, they had some jank to them. Games like Infamous, you know, they or at least Infamous 1, you know, it kind of feels tech demo-y, you know, you're not really sure, but it has really cool elements to it. In almost every case, You know, the story is lacking. They just have cool mechanics and they kind of build on them. The gameplay is more or less the same throughout the entire game. But Marvel's Spider-Man just blew every single expectation I had out of the water. Its story was awesome. It had great twists in it. They had great visual presentations and set pieces, and they switched things up. Characters would keep coming back even though you might not think that they're that important. They did such a great job with that. The web slinging is probably the best it's ever been, which is pretty crazy because some of the older Spider-Man games had some pretty nice web slinging in it. So, you know, they did a really good job nailing that. The combat was nice and fluid. It never got old because you had so many tools at your disposal to use. You could swap suits all around, and you could choose whatever cosmetic suit you wanted and then add whatever power to it. They just did such a good job. And on top of that, like the open world elements, they didn't force it on you. They let you do whatever you want. There was a couple sequences where you just needed to do like 1 or 2 side quests for Spider-Man to take a break or what have you. And then they throw you right back into the story if you want to do it. I had such a good time with Marvel Spider-Man. In my thoughts video, I said that it was basically magnificent in every way, and I had no negative things to say about it. And to this day, I still have no negative things to say about it. It was such a good game. Very, very happy to have played it. If I played it in 2018, it would have hands down been my game of the year. So there you go. Now, for most disappointing game that I played this year, also, you know, it's just any game that I played this year, I was kind of not really sure what I wanted to do here, because on one hand, I was disappointed with Kingdom Hearts 3. It wasn't that it was a bad game per se, but I guess it just had everything to do with my expectations. This was the conclusion, you know, the what I would assume would be the final game. You know, there could obviously be more, but it was going to cap things off. And so I was looking for a lot of answers, and I didn't get those answers. But it was between Kingdom Hearts 3 and Ys Memories of Celceta. For Memories of Celceta, it was just one of those things where it was a large departure from the previous titles. They didn't build upon all the things that I liked from the previous games. In Ys Origin, you know, it had a really fast-paced combat. In Memories of Celceta, they slowed it down. In Origin, they had all kinds of crazy fast-paced projectiles and it kept you moving. In Memories of Celceta, you didn't really have very many things to dodge. It was just kind of, in some ways, I don't really want to describe it as this, but it kind of, you know, it had on-rail shooter kind of looks to it. You know, the camera was always focused on the boss. So, you know, your movement was always dependent on what the boss was doing and moving, rather than, you know, an overhead view of the map and you just kind of jumping around trying to find your opening. And then on top of that, it wasn't all too, well, just wasn't done well as far as its semi-open world aspect to it. It had you explore the forest at the beginning, and ultimately, basically everything that happened in the forest felt pointless until you got to a certain point in the game past the forest where things start making sense and the story starts unfolding. So I had a lot of issues with Ys Memory of Celceta. Had some issues with Kingdom Hearts 3, and I think ultimately my choice is going with Ys Memory of Celceta. I really did have such a good time with Ys Origin, and Ys 1 and 2 were very different games, but I ultimately had fun with them. So when I got to Ys, I'm just gonna call it Ys 4 now, it was just so different. It changed too much, and a lot of those changes weren't for the better. I'm looking for more progression in the Ys series, and Ys Origin still claims, you know, the pinnacle spot of the combat. Ys 3 was following in that similar vein. Wasn't, you know, as good, but it was still in the same vein as Ys Origin. So I was kind of just, I was really disappointed in Ys 4. But as I mentioned in my thought video, if this is the platform where I can now play a subsequent 3D Ys game and have it learn from all the mistakes that Ys 4 made, then I'll be okay with that. But ultimately, it is going to have to come down to Ys 4 being my most disappointing game of the year. Now, for some honorable mentions, this one was an interesting one for me as well because, you know, I definitely haven't played very many 2019 games this year. And normally, I would keep the honorable mentions as games that released in 2019 because these are contenders for the game of the year. But there's one game in particular that I played this year that raised the bar for every single RPG I play from this point forward, and that was Xenogears. This game had some of the best writing I've ever experienced in video game. I was absolutely floored with a lot of the things that this game did. I can't help but not give it an honorable mention and just kind of break the unfounded rules that I have this one time, I guess. It was just a phenomenal game that I had to do it. I guess the biggest downsides on why it couldn't be one of the greats in my personal eyes is that I could see the progression of the game's downfall as I was moving through the game. A lot of the details just started to die down. And then once you get to disc 2, it's just a sad thing to experience. It's not that I'm disappointed in disc 2 or that I'm mad at it or anything like that. It's just sad, you know, that this game up until then really does stand out as an incredible game. And then you get to disc 2, which is just, it feels like an epilogue. There's not much interaction to it. There's definitely not much closure to it at all either. But even with that, I still have to acknowledge the 40-50 hours prior to that were pretty exquisite. Xenogears, definitely an honorable mention, breaking the rules. My next honorable mention is Tales of Vesperia Definitive Edition. This was one of my anticipated games of 2018, and this game delivered like I thought it would. I like the Tales series. They're a ton of fun. The combat, it can be up and down, but ultimately the combat is enjoyable for me. It's usually pretty simplistic, but in a lot of ways there's nothing wrong with that. So I liked this one. The story was a little bit more bonkers than I was expecting, and I didn't get a lot of the answers that I was hoping for through the game. And I don't actually think the inclusion of Patty was the most revolutionizing thing that could have happened. It was kind of on the disappointing side, and Flynn isn't really all too much of an inclusion in the game either, but it's still one of my favorite Tales of games, and a lot of that rides on Yuri being one of the best protagonists in video games, period, for me. He's not one of those typical JRPG characters. He will do what's necessary for the goals that need to be done. If he has to save 5 people in front of him and he needs to kill 2 guards to do it, he's gonna do it. If a town's gonna get blown up and, you know, he's gotta kill the king to save the town, he's gonna kill the king. You know, he is not a stereotypical anime protagonist, and that's what sets this game so far apart, because a lot of the characters in Tales of Vesperia kind of ride that line sometimes, where it's just like, hey, you know, hey, you're doing something different. So that's one of the reasons why I really like Tales of Vesperia, is Yuri's focus on needing to do what needs to be done. And the story as a whole is actually a pretty enjoyable one, and the combat is, at least at the time, the pinnacle of the the Tales of franchise. It's gotten better since then, but you know, there you go. And my last honorable mention is gonna have to be Astral Chain. I did want to include Pokemon Sword because I think Pokemon Sword does a really good job at a lot of aspects, and it really just kind of gave me everything I asked for. But Astral Chain was kind of out of left field for me, and that was particularly enjoyable for me because you could say I'm not the biggest action-y game fan. You know, I play them here and there, but I'm not very good at them. I tend to struggle a little bit. The difficulty is always on the low side for me, as far as me choosing that, because I know I'm going to have a hard time. But Astral Chain just kind of stands out quite a bit. Its story was lacking in some areas. I definitely didn't get the conclusion that I was hoping for, and I didn't get a lot of answers as early on as I was hoping for, but its story was nice. The characters and some of the twists were really, really good, but shining above all of that was its extremely creative combat system. I can't praise the ingenuity of how they implement the various uses of each type of combat style that you can have. And then on top of having all the different, I forget the name of, we're just gonna call them the animal companions. You know, the robot guys with the chain. On top of having all of those at your disposal, you then also have the additional mechanic of being able to use the chain in combat. You can do so many things with the chain that it just blows my mind how the combat is really, really good on its own. And then you add the chain, and then you add this, and then you add that, and it never feels too complex. It just feels like you have a variety of options and they're all viable. And that's really well done by the developers of Astral Chain. So gotta give that game props as well. And I think I've talked pretty much enough about all my favorite and memorable games of 2019. My most anticipated games for 2020 are probably not a surprise, but Final Fantasy VII Remake. I played Final Fantasy VII, the original, a long time ago. I got to Sephiroth in the crater, if that means anything to you, and I died. He threw lots of planets at me and stars and things like that, and I just couldn't beat him. But I'm gonna get around to playing Final Fantasy VII again. I don't really have any recollection of the story, but you know, there's important cultural things that happen in that game that I definitely remember, and I want to experience it again, because when Final Fantasy VII Remake comes out, I want to be one of those people that looks at it and be like, oh my goodness, this changed, that changed. So I'm really looking forward to Final Fantasy Original 7 playthrough, and then my experience with Final Fantasy VII Remake. My second most anticipated game is Tales of Arise. Haven't seen too much footage of this game. It's been kind of dark for the most part, but I'm a Tales fan. Tales of Vesperia was on my list last year, and you know, if they're gonna release a Tales game in 2020, it's gotta be on my list for most anticipated games. Of the footage that I have seen, it looks fantastic. The visuals look so on point, and I'm ready for it. There's really not much more to say. I can't wait to experience that anime JRPG goodness. And my final game, which could be a little bit of a surprise, but most likely not, Cyberpunk 2077. I haven't played too many of these type of games on my stream, but it's something that's going to be there eventually. There's some games there, but Cyberpunk 2077 is definitely on my radar. It looks like a ton of fun, and it's 100% one of those games that I would want to play. I played Witcher 3, and I played all the Witcher games except for the first one, and I liked all of them. I guess that only leaves Witcher 2 and Witcher 3, but I liked them both. I played Dragon Age Inquisition, I played Dragon Age Origins. I love them both. I've played all the Mass Effect games. Like, this game is totally up my alley as far as impactful character decisions and a setting that looks really, really awesome. You know, it's like Deus Ex and The Witcher 3 or something like that, all mashed together. I'm looking forward to it. Looks great, and definitely going to be playing that on release or very close to release. That's all I got. 2019 has been somewhat of a wild ride. I have played a lot of games, have experienced a lot of things, and it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. Can't wait for 2020. It's hopefully going to be even more fun. Not too many other games on my radar for 2020, but if I'm lucky, all the games that don't have release dates will release in 2020, and it'll be a busy year. So thanks for watching. Appreciate it. See you on the next video. Peace.